Why on earth did they change Order 66? If you went back in time to May 2005, opening week of Revenge of the Sith, and showed somebody everything there was to see about Order 66, their perception of what happened would be so completely different compared to someone who's kept up with all of Star Wars until today. Order 66 is one of the coolest moments in all of Star Wars. Yeah, it sucked, but it was the pinnacle of the Clone Wars. Not to mention, it makes for some of the best moments in video games. People love it so much and can't get enough of it to the point where they've modded other games to create their own Order 66 scenarios. And again, the community loves these, they eat them up. Whether you're a clone gunning down everyone in the Jedi Temple, or if you're a Jedi fighting the clones, or even Anakin fighting the Jedi, and possibly some younglings, Order 66 is such an iconic moment in Star Wars, it really was interesting to do this deep dive and look at all the things they've changed about it in the last 19 years since it happened. Because as you know, in Star Wars, things changed, and I didn't realize it until I started heavily researching this, that there's quite a bit of controversy around this in some of the darker corners of the Star Wars community. The biggest change being the addition of the genetic chip implant that is now the reason the clones carried it out, because it wasn't always like this. The clones originally had control over themselves and actually knew that they would soon turn on the Jedi. And Order 66 on its own is a traumatic enough event that wrapping your head around it as a kid was pretty hard. But then as you get 4 to 5 seasons into the Clone Wars TV show, it gets even harder. Because you see how close the clones got with the Jedi generals and how they treat them. And you have trouble believing that these are the same clones that would soon obey an order to gun down their friends, their family. It just doesn't make sense anymore, and everything up until that point said that the clones knew about Order 66 all along, and they consciously chose to follow orders and execute the Jedi. And ultimately, the Clone Wars show is why this had to change, and it literally did just that. But before we talk about it, let's go back and learn how and why Order 66 even worked in the first place. Unless you're the one person who's been living under a rock since 2005, you know that Order 66 was orchestrated by Palpatine to use the clone army to wipe out the Jedi Order so he could rule the galaxy. If he didn't get rid of them, there would be a huge problem when he tried to turn the Republic into his empire. So number 1 on his to-do list was Control-Alt-Delete the Jedi. And this plan goes all the way back to the very creation of the clone army. Now, for the sake of this video, we're going to talk about Order 66 chronologically, as in the order of things released. Obviously, you would think, starting us off in May of 2005, opening weekend of Episode 3, right? Well, kind of. Actually, for the prequels, merchandise played such a big role in the franchise that usually a full month before the movie comes out, they would release the novel, video games, comic books, even reference books. Literally all of the spoilers you could ever dream of a full month before the premiere. In Phantom Menace, they spoiled Qui-Gon's death with the soundtrack to the movie. Honestly, I have no idea why they would ever do this. I can't imagine anyone doing this today because it just seems so counterintuitive. But I guess they knew that fans were going to see the movie either way, and by publishing everything a month early, it would boost the merch sales like crazy. But of course, in turn, you're also giving up all the spoilers for the film a full month ahead of its release. But I mean, honestly, if you watch the trailer for any new movie today, it reveals the plot, the secret bad guy, the twist, and the big fight at the end, leaving you no reason to pay $20 to watch it in theaters. So, even though the Revenge of the Sith novel, junior novel, scrapbook, even the visual dictionary all came out on April 2nd, almost 7 full weeks before the movie dropped on May 19th. And believe it or not, the comics started coming out weekly halfway through March, which is insane. Literally the entire plot of the movie. We'll get to all these in a second. Majority watched the movie first, and that was all that we had, was what was in the movies. We saw the mystery of the clones' creation and them in action at the end of Episode 2, and then we get to see them fight briefly in the first half of Episode 3, operating purely as soldiers, and then they get issued what seemed to be a secret order by the Supreme Chancellor, and they immediately turn on and kill all of their Jedi peers, which made it feel like the clones were in league with Palpatine all along. But also, how could a bunch of normal, humanoid soldiers best all of the galaxy's greatest, most powerful Force users? It almost doesn't make sense, and I realized the further that I dug into this hole that each time someone adds new material or information to Order 66, it's almost always to prove why it worked. Because there's so many reasons why it shouldn't have worked, but it did. And the deeper we go, the more you'll realize people keep changing it to back up how Palpatine pulled something as crazy as this off. Now, the first bit of extra info we got on this was from all of the above. For our sake, let's start with the novel. Here it shows Palpatine calling Cody to tell him to execute Order 66. Keep in mind, this is right after Obi-Wan just showed up and Cody gave him his lightsaber back. And after he receives the order, it says that Cody responded as he was trained to. He would follow this order without hesitation or regret. But it does say that he was human enough to... Oh wait, he just says he wishes Palpatine gave him the order before he gave Kenobi his saber back. I thought it was going to say Cody felt some sort of repressed guilt or something, but nope, he just wished his job was easier. I mean, with this and the movie, it really seems like the clones are purely soldiers to the Jedi and nothing more. Like they don't care about each other in the slightest, and they had no problem consciously carrying out Order 66. They were raised to follow orders. That was their purpose, so to them, it was nothing new, just another part of their job. And you would think that the junior novel would be, if anything, would be a more kid-friendly version of the official novel for younger readers, but surprisingly enough, this version is so much more sadistic than the actual novel. This version shows Palpatine calling Commander Cody, issuing the order, and then calling the next commander, issuing them the order, and then another, and another, and another. It just shows him individually calling each and every clone commander to personally give them the kill order, and it says that with each call, his smile grew bigger. That's wild. It says he leaned back in his chair and pictured all of the Jedi being murdered across the galaxy. The ones in jungle planets, the crystal worlds, the ones on water worlds, the ones in battle, and the ones safe in their command centers. It says he pictured all of them. And yes, I double checked, this is the junior novel. It also says he could sense it happening, not in detail, but he could feel himself growing stronger in the dark side with each Jedi death. And then it says that his only regret was that he couldn't be there in person to watch each one of them die. What? Patricia, take it easy on the young readers. I think someone just swapped the authors on accident because Matthew Stover basically glazes over it compared to this. It also says that the Jedi forgot that ultimately the clones belong to the Republic, not the Jedi, meaning that they would follow the Chancellor's orders without question, even if they were ordered to kill their Jedi leaders. Now, interestingly enough, the book does mention Palpatine sensing the mass genocide, and also this is the first to mention that Yoda could actually sense the aura of the dark side clinging to the clones that were trying to kill him, which I thought was really interesting because the only other mention of this, the dark side clinging to the clones, was in Battlefront 3. Yup, you heard me right, we will get to that soon, but real quick, if you're enjoying the video, whip out your own Youngling Slayer 9000 and whack the crap out of that subscribe button and send this to your Star Wars friends. It's totally free and it really helps support the channel. I would love to keep making fun videos like this. I really appreciate it. Now, in the scrapbook, it confirms that the clones were simply trained to obey their commanding officers without question, and that Supreme Chancellor Palpatine was the Army of the Republic's supreme commander, while all of the Jedi were technically just generals, so Palpatine outranks them. Now, as novels and comics and informative books normally do, these two provided more context to Order 66. Specifically, these all seem to find more reason to support Order 66 being a success, and telling us how a bunch of clones were able to best all of the Jedi in the galaxy. The visual dictionary tells us that despite their intuitive force powers, the Jedi were unaware the clones had been trained to obey numerous emergency protocols that could be activated by the Supreme Chancellor. Almost an oversight on the Jedi's part. It had been 3 years since they started fighting with the clones. How did nobody ever find this out? But for the first time, it says that Order 66 was a secret directive made to assassinate the Jedi. After receiving this secret order, the clones would immediately identify all Jedi as traitors to the Republic and proceed to murder them. And this is important because this is the first mention that Order 66 was a secret directive, implying it was something only the clones, Palpatine, and maybe the Kaminoans knew about. Which completely checks out. Even Filoni mentioned recently how the Kaminoans knowing about Order 66 works.
The Kaminoans, they don't really care about the Republic winning. What they care about is producing a lot of clones and making money. They're profiteers as much as anybody is.
I mean, also, it being an emergency contingency plan is pretty believable. It was there just in case the Jedi stepped out of line or turned bad. Think Paul and Krell from the Umbara arc. It was borderline justified to execute Order 66 on Krell. The thing that makes the Order 66 emergency plan a little sus is if it was actually a secret hidden from the Jedi. Now, the book also confirms that because of their deep core learning programs, the clones neither hesitated nor felt any remorse for assassinating their leaders. These are completely different clones than the ones from the Clone Wars show. And since the show didn't exist yet, we didn't know how human clones could be. Can they feel emotions? Can they sympathize for another being? We had no idea. In this book actually says that the Jedi assumed that the clones were able to feel compassion simply because of how they cared for the creatures they utilized on all the different worlds to use as mounts or as transports for supplies. But even though they showed signs of having humanity, ultimately their loyalty still lied with Palpatine. Now, moving forward in time, 2 weeks to April 13th, we finally get the third issue of the Revenge of the Sith comic with Order 66 in it, which is our first visual of the scenes actually happening. And honestly, this comic might actually be crazier than what happened in the actual movie. While it has a lot of the same deaths and scenes, they play out a lot differently and almost more brutal. The clones would address their commanders before executing them. The silence from the movie is gone. On Megiddo, Commander Bacara walks up to Ki-Adi-Mundi and calls out to him and says "General," and then just blasts him in the chest before he even got to pull out his lightsaber. On Felucia, Aayla Secura asks Commander Bly why it just got quiet, if he thought it was because of droids. He responds to her no, and then just blasts her in the back, and the whole squad just opens fire on her corpse. There was a deleted scene of this from the movie, but honestly the derpiness of the previs doesn't hold the same weight as the comic does. Elsewhere on Felucia, Barriss Offee is literally fighting droids, and her own ATTE blows her to smithereens. There's a deleted scene of this too, where they step on her afterwards. And then on Kashyyyk, in the movie we see Luminara and Unduli on screen for a little bit, but in the comic they show us what happens right after this scene, and it's not pretty. It's literally just all of the same clones executing her on the spot. And then on the same planet, Quinlan Vos has a clone turbo tank blast him from behind with its laser cannon. There was a deleted scene for this too, but for some reason instead of shooting him from behind, the turbo tank he's in just rolls up to another one, and the other just opens fire, full auto in the building, point blank, killing him and all of the clones in the tank. This too feels a little goofy, like a cartoon with the two tanks meeting face to face like that, and unlike the movie where Yoda is meditating and these clones try to sneak up on him, in the comic it's completely different. There's an all-out battle between him, Tarful, and Chewbacca versus Gree and at least 10 of his scout troopers. I don't know why, but this version seems so much more intense than the movie. Now, again, moving forward another 2 weeks closer to the movie's release, May 5th, we get the iconic Revenge of the Sith video game for PS2 and Xbox. This is a complete playthrough of every single scene from the movie and all the scenes that got cut and became deleted scenes. And since a lot of the game was fighting based, which is awesome, it doesn't give too much more context to the story side of things. Except that in the official game guide, it again confirms with the visual dictionary that Order 66 was in fact a pre-programmed directive that simply commanded the clones to turn on the Jedi. And now this catches us up with the movie's release. And up to this point, everything we know is that Order 66 was a secretly programmed emergency directive for the clones, and ultimately, they belonged to the Republic, meaning Palpatine was their supreme commander, and they would do whatever he ordered without question, hesitation, or regret. It was emotionless, just another order, which is really dark. They are clones, and at this point, we haven't seen their human side ever. It wasn't until 2008 that we got full stories surrounding just clone troopers on screen. Next, 6 months later, we get the Star Wars Republic comic issue 78, where we revisit Order 66 to see some of the first Jedi ever outside of the movie that survived the Purge. It shows some that survived out of luck. This Jedi has fallen to the ground and is just laying here on a foggy planet, and the clones just can't find her. And then it shows some Jedi that survived because of skill, suggesting that this little grasshopper Jedi was more skilled in combat than Ki-Adi-Mundi, Aayla Secura, all the other Jedi who fell that day. And then it mentions those who were not involved with the war and weren't commanding clones that survived. It also shows a Jedi who thought it was a defect in the cloning process. It shows one Jedi that says his master once said that a skilled Force user could make a comfortable living as a gambler, and then wandered off, which is really funny. I'd like to think that he went off and made a good life for himself. And then it shows one Jedi Master ambushing the clones and points out that maybe the Jedi aren't so easy to kill when they know who their enemy is, suggesting that the reason that so many Jedi fell to Order 66 is because the people closest to them were the ones that killed them. They were too shocked and confused for the majority to survive. I think that, along with how outnumbered they were, are all pretty good indicators of it being skewed in the clones' favor. Now, the next massive addition to the lore behind Order 66 comes in a warm welcome from Battlefront 2 just 1 month later. And let me tell you, if you grew up with Battlefront 2, you know that this was the game to play as a fan of Star Wars. And even today, it's still amazing. Now, as much as I played instant action non-stop after school each day, I actually never went through the campaign until recently, and I had no idea how dark it actually was. The campaign starts out by confirming that the clones were working with Palpatine behind the Jedi's backs. Palpatine was the one that originally sent the 501st to Megiddo with Ki-Adi-Mundi. The Jedi thought they were there to take out a droid energy collector or something, but really, Palpatine wanted the 501st to go retrieve an experimental power source for his super laser. Hint, hint, and they were successful.
Nicely done, gentlemen. Your work here today has made the Chancellor a very happy man.
And Ki-Adi had no idea the entire time. He never found out. But this was a turning point for the 501st because it was here that they said they realized the Jedi could be fooled, which meant the Jedi could be killed. It also talks about how highly the clones thought of Aayla Secura. You could say they had a soft spot for her. The 501st spent months fighting on Felucia, which we all know is a very unforgiving planet. The clones were getting killed off not only by the droids, but by flesh-eating diseases and predators that were nocturnal, picking them off during the nights. And the clones said that Aayla Secura was their only hope, and that without her, none of them would have survived Felucia with their sanity. And because of that, they hoped her death would be quick. When the 501st were rotated out of Felucia, Aayla Secura personally came to see them off, telling them that they were the bravest soldiers she had ever seen. And then this next thing is so sad.
It's a good thing we were wearing helmets, because none of us could bear to look her in the eye.
Not only does this mean that part of them was human enough to have a heart and care enough about their Jedi generals and what they did for their clones, but that they also knew Order 66 was coming, and that none of them could do anything about it. They were sad that one day they would have to execute her. This is huge. Not only the confirmation of the clones finally being able to have some kind of empathy and care towards the Jedi, but also that they knew Order 66 was coming. That's crazy. Now, after all of this, the 501st were discreetly transferred back to Coruscant for Knightfall, the day that Jedi Temple fell, and it was silent. No one said anything. They all knew what was about to happen, what they were about to do, and it mentioned that some of the clones had doubts, traitorous thoughts, and even still, no one said a word. This again is insane. The fact that they knew what was coming, and some of them had morality issues and thought about deserting, but also that none of them did because they were soldiers. They had to follow orders. That's why they were there in the first place. Battlefront 2 added so much to the Order 66 lore. We also learned they were working with Palpatine behind the Jedi's backs. And we also see for the very first time that they do feel something. They felt appreciative towards Aayla Secura enough to feel sorry for what was about to happen to her, which also meant that the clones knew Order 66 was coming before it was initiated. And having the entire story voiced by Temuera Morrison himself, the OG clone, was just the cherry on top of the cake. If there's anyone out there who hasn't played this campaign yet, I definitely recommend it. Now, the next mention of Order 66 is just a couple weeks after Battlefront 2 dropped in the novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Vader. This story takes place immediately after the end of Episode 3 and follows Vader as Palpatine sends him to clean up any Jedi survivors. It mostly deals with Anakin learning what it means to be a Sith, but we do get a massive new bit of story surrounding Order 66. This book tells us that the clones weren't actually hardwired with Order 66 by the Kaminoans. They weren't created with something inside of them that made them do it. Instead, they were programmed, mainly the commanders, to demonstrate unfailing loyalty to the Supreme Chancellor. And because of this, some of the clones, when ordered to execute the Jedi, deliberately refused to comply. The Battlefront game hinted at this, but basically it said they could never do it. Or at least the 501st couldn't disobey Palpatine. You don't want to have to answer to the newly established Lord Vader during his first day on the job. But still, this is our first confirmation that some clones actually had enough of a moral dilemma with this order, or possibly had developed some type of feelings toward their generals, so much so that they consciously chose not to obey and deserted. That's wild. Palpatine actually says in this book that the reason some of the clones deserted was because they were infected. They were infected by fighting alongside the Jedi for 3 years, and that there's only so much you can program a being to do, clone or not. Eventually, their experiences shape them into their own thing, which is interesting. It's the complete opposite of how the clone army starts out. I love that Palpatine was aware of this and admitted that the Clone Wars had gone on long enough that some of the troopers started deviating from their training and became influenced just like a normal person would be by their life experiences. They had been fighting in the Clone Wars for 3 years since the first batch was deployed on Geonosis, and apparently 3 years was just enough time for some of them to start feeling things they shouldn't. The Jedi's wisdom and teachings that probably rubbed off on the clones in those 3 years gave some of them enough of a moral compass to choose to disobey the Supreme Commander and commit treason. Which makes me think that if Palpatine waited any longer to pull the trigger, if it took the Jedi any longer to figure out that he was a Sith Lord, Order 66 just might not have worked. If they had just a little more time to connect with the Jedi, I bet more of them would have revolted. In fact, the more time that passed, the more clones would sway from their programming and would have chosen the right thing to do. I find that really interesting. It really happened at the last possible second. I absolutely love that this novel added all of this to the story. Finally, another bit of humanity confirmed for the first time in the Clone Troopers. And keep in mind, this book only came out 6 months after the movie. So much has already happened in such little time. And it's actually the last thing that comes out in 2005 regarding Order 66. But that's not to say that this next book we're going to talk about is anything but incredible. It's part of the 5-book series that ties into the Republic Commandos game, which, first off, if you haven't played the game, please do yourself a favor and play through it. It is a gem of its time, from running your way through bugs to becoming absolutely terrified of the B-2 battle droids, to getting our first glance at the Republic Commandos. Trust me, you won't regret the 5 or so hours it takes to get through the campaign. But like I was saying, the book titled Order 66 is the 4th out of 6 books. And you might say, Michael, didn't you just say it was a 5-book series? Yes, unfortunately the series was cancelled before the author could finish the last book and resolve the main storyline. And it wasn't cancelled because the books were bad. Most people loved the books, but unfortunately the last book was in production while they were making Clone Wars, and since Mandalore and the Mandalorian culture were a huge part in the books, and the Clone Wars show was starting to get into Mandalore on its own, they were both headed in very different directions. Travis, the author, said it would have been so much more than just the normal retcon fixes that it just wasn't possible, and that the only fix she could think of is an entire reboot of the series, which she almost pulled the trigger on. But 5 books in, on a 6-book journey, isn't the most ideal point to start over. Plus, she didn't want to let down all the readers and fans of the current story. Plus, at the time, she was also working on a number of other books. So sadly, their story ended before it was concluded. Thankfully enough, over the years, she received so many emails from fans asking what would have happened to the characters in the final book that she actually posted on her blog what would happen to everyone just to give the fans a little bit of closure. Even with how it ended, if you need something to read, I'd highly recommend these. The one we're talking about introduced a lot of new concrete lore around Order 66 now 3 years after the movie. The biggest thing being the actual Order itself. Here it is if you want to pause and read it. It basically says that if the Jedi ever act against the interest of the Republic, the Supreme Chancellor can issue a command allowing the clones to remove the Jedi with lethal force. Which, I mean, half of it makes sense. Keep in mind Pong Krell. At this point, it's literally just a contingency plan in case the Jedi go rogue and start murking senators or mistreating clones. Cough, cough. Still, I thought it was really cool to see the actual Order in person. True Colors, the book before, actually establishes Order 4, 5, and 65. For the spark notes on these, Order 4 basically says if Palpatine ever becomes incapacitated and is not able to command, the Vice Chair of the Senate will do his job until a successor is appointed. Order 5 says if Palpatine is declared unfit to issue orders, the Chief of Defense will take over, but this next one is the most interesting. Order 65 says almost the exact opposite of Order 66. It says that the Senate can take a vote, and if the majority says that Chancellor Palpatine is unfit to issue orders, the clone commanders will be authorized to detain the Chancellor with lethal force if necessary. That's crazy! These are all literally just contingency plans for different emergency scenarios with an order to take out Palpatine if needed, right next to Order 66. I was not expecting this. Honestly, this just normalizes the what if to take out the Jedi. These are literally just worst case scenario procedures. And this book also confirmed that there are 150 of these contingency orders, all varying for different what if scenarios. And ever since the clones could remember, they had to memorize and repeat these orders over and over and over again until they knew them by heart. And I really like that the book establishes there was 150 of them, and it wasn't just one secret order. It feels much more normalized like this. It's honestly kind of genius of Palpatine to hide them in plain sight like this, and having an order to dethrone himself right next to the one to execute the Jedi makes it seem like he had just as much power as the Jedi did, or the Senate. And surprisingly enough, this book also says that all 150 orders were able to be seen by the Jedi. They were all on the mainframe, and anybody could read them whenever they wanted, instead of it being a secret directive like the Visual Dictionary said it was in 2005. Which honestly, I kind of like this better. There's a scene in the book where a Jedi General and one of the clones talk while Order 66 is going down, which is really rare. I think in all of Star Wars, there's only 2, maybe 3 conversations that happen between clones and a Jedi while they're trying to kill each other. And here, the Jedi stumbles half dead into his office the clone is rifting through and asks him why. Why did the clones try to kill all the Jedi? And the clone responded, orders. You never read the contingency orders? They're on the mainframe. I guess nobody ever thinks they'll be needed. And the Jedi asks why again, and the clone says he's never disobeyed an order. What was he supposed to do? Pick and choose? The Jedi thought we were excellent troops because we're so disciplined and obey orders. Until we obey all orders, and then we betray them. And then he tells the Jedi he can't have it both ways, which is pretty interesting to hear this coming from a clone's perspective. It's the first time we get more than the Battlefront 2, we're clones, gotta kill the Jedi. And then the clone asks the Jedi if it was true that Master Windu tried to overthrow the Chancellor. And the Jedi responds with, Palpatine's a Sith, can't you see? He's taking over the government. And the clone just said, what's a Sith? And the Jedi has to explain to him it's basically the opposite of a Jedi. And the clone asks him why he couldn't use his Force powers to see Palpatine for what he was. And the Jedi just walks away. Didn't even answer because he didn't have one. But what's interesting about this is, in the Revenge of the Sith novel that came out with the movie, they kind of answer this as well, but I'm not sure the Jedi actually knew why they couldn't sense it. It says that the war itself poured darkness into the Force, and it clouded the Jedi's view and limited their perception. And it also says that since clones had no hatred or ill will towards the Jedi, there was nothing that could have given them a warning. It wasn't until Yoda felt all the fallen Jedi did he realize something was wrong. The clones were just following orders, and so the Jedi weren't able to sense any bad emotions coming. This book also shows a bit more of the confusion of the clones. We saw a little between the clone and the Jedi, which I liked. They both heard different things. Palpatine trying to overthrow the Jedi, and the clones heard the Jedi attack their leader. This makes the conversations of them trying to piece things together so interesting. It says that all the information the clones got was that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic and tried to overthrow the Chancellor, and some of the clones couldn't believe the Jedi would betray the Republic. They could never have seen that coming and wondered how the Jedi could betray them like this. Nobody thought the Jedi would ever turn bad. This book also shows us it wasn't blind obedience that made the clones follow this order. Along with all the other more dangerous allies on the contingency list, the Jedi were ones they could not simply detain. They had to use lethal force. And an order was an order. It had to be followed or society would fall apart. It wasn't the clones' responsibility to pick and choose which orders to follow. That would undermine the democracy and would lead to overthrowing the government. And for the clones, orders are what kept them alive. The orders came from someone who could see the bigger picture, and it was the clones' job to trust those giving the orders. But the clones in this book were different. One of them gets married to a Jedi and he actually has a kid with her, and he wasn't ready to go kill his wife. So most of these clones didn't follow Order 66. It was interesting reading that upon hearing Order 66 be issued, one of the clones thought he was remembering the contingency orders wrong, and 66 was code for shutting down the banking system to avoid an enemy cyber attack. Because the last thing the clones were expecting was a Jedi betrayal. This also strays from the Battlefront lore of the clones knowing ahead of time that Order 66 was coming. And honestly, this book added so much and changed a lot. The biggest things being the 150 contingency orders that were public compared to Order 66 being one secret directive, which I liked. Also, it changed the clones from knowing it was coming to having no idea at all, adding a sense of confusion between the clones and the Jedi who were both betrayed by Palpatine. And this is one of my favorite parts. I love seeing the clones and Jedi get to talk to each other during the chaos and try to figure out what's going on. This, along with Dark Lord Rise of Vader, confirms that there was clone troopers who chose not to obey the order, which is huge. Now, surprisingly enough, the next addition to Order 66 is Battlefront 3. Yup, the game that never got made. Probably one of the most anticipated sequels that just never happened. This was the first in a now very long and common list of Star Wars cancellations. A lot of production and the actual story on this game was finished to the point where the Star Wars community has made a custom build to run the parts of the game that were completed. And along with this, a lot of the story was leaked, and the same story that was going to be Battlefront 3's campaign got ported to the PSP and DS release of Battlefront Elite Squadron, which you can play play today. This game came out in 2009 and was the Battlefront you could first take a ship from a ground to a space battle in, which was really cool. But the campaign follows two unique and highly skilled clones known as X1 and X2. Spoiler, but later you learn they were the only two clones created from a Jedi's DNA, which is really cool. But right now they're clone commanders that were tasked with training the clone army before Geonosis. Now, when Order 66 starts, X2 immediately questions what's going on. I guess for some reason, even though they had directly interacted with Palpatine previously, they hadn't gotten the order themselves. The other clones immediately try to assassinate their Jedi general, and the Jedi immediately realizes this was somehow Palpatine. X1, his brother, sees the Jedi kill the entire squad of clones, like absolutely just manhandles them. And he tries to get X2 to help him stop the Jedi because he's killing all of the clones. X1 almost dies to the Jedi. And then at the last second, X2 jumps in to save him, and this is actually the only second time a clone has a conversation with the Jedi during Order 66, trying to figure out what the heck is going on.
X2, stop! The Jedi are not your enemy! You tried to kill my brother! Only in self-defense! You just murdered most of our platoon! I had no choice!
And then you execute Order 66. The Jedi tries to get you to search your feelings and realize he's not a traitor, but you just watched him murder all of those clones. This is one of my favorite conversations we get between the two opposing forces. Right now, the clones consciously followed the order to kill the Jedi, and there's no way that they didn't feel some type of way about it, whether it was guilt, hesitation, or confusion. And I love exploring these moments where both sides are trying to figure out what's going on and why one side would betray the other. Next, just a year later, we get a random addition to the lore through Dark Times Blue Harvest, a comic where Vader is being sent on a wild goose chase by Palpatine, and he can't stop thinking about his master lying to him and going behind his back. After the battle, Vader one-on-one addresses his clone commander and brings up Order 66 and how Palpatine foresaw that the Jedi would attempt to stop him from turning the Republic to the Empire, and prepared by indoctrinating all the clones with Order 66 from childhood. And so Vader directly asks Commander Vil if Palpatine gave the clones a similar order, but one to attack him if the Emperor ever needed them to. Vil says that even if there was a such thing, he couldn't tell Vader about it, and that was confirmation enough that this theoretical Order 151, the contingency to kill Vader, existed. Vader immediately kills him and then never speaks of this again. I like the simple addition of another emergency plan to the clones' contingency list because this story takes place very shortly after Revenge of the Sith, so I'm curious how soon after Anakin pledged his allegiance to Palpatine, he gave all the clones this secret directive. It makes you think that even Palpatine was a little scared of Vader's true potential. Now, this is the breaking point. This is the alternate timeline, the breakaway from everything previously established since the movie. To start off Clone Wars Season 6, we get the Battle of Ringo Vinda that features a clone trooper prematurely executing a Jedi. Yup, this is the start of a 4-part arc that explains the new canon explanation behind Order 66. And this comes straight from George Lucas himself with Dave Filoni, of course. This story introduces a completely new piece of the puzzle, the clone inhibitor chip. These were genetic biochip implants that every single clone had, and its sole purpose was to force the clone to carry out Order 66. When found, they said that their purpose was to make the clones more docile and allowed them to follow orders better. But both of these were a lie, a complete cover-up. This chip turned every clone trooper into Palpatine's sleeper agent, and when they heard the order, they, without control over themselves, would be forced to execute any Jedi and anyone helping the Jedi. And this changed everything about Order 66 that we previously knew. It gets rid of the 150 contingency orders. It gets rid of any previous deserters since they weren't able to. And most importantly, it takes away the clones' free will. Up until now, the biggest part of Order 66 is that every single one of the clones was completely in control of themselves and consciously made the decision to be a good soldier and follow orders no matter the context. And as years passed, we learned of the hardships they faced with that, the confusion they went through being used and trusting their orders. We learned about those that couldn't pull the trigger and deserted. It was this huge moral dilemma they faced being soldiers and not in a position to question orders till now, having that free will taken away from them. I think as the Clone Wars show came out, 5 seasons of it specifically, it was able to humanize the clones in a way that the movies didn't have time to. The show was able to show us the part of the clones that makes them human, and that they were able to show sympathy and care about others. We saw firsthand that the clones did in fact bond with their Jedi generals. It was actually more common than not for them to have a strong bond. Because during those 3 years they fought in the Clone Wars, they were able to find their compass, their own personal code of conduct and moral line of what they think is right or wrong. They believe that they're fighting for the good of the galaxy, to free the worlds from under separatist control and to save as many people as they can from becoming casualties of this war. And even back in 2005, the year the movie came out, in the Dark Lord novel, Palpatine actually acknowledges that after 3 years, each individual clone's experience would shape them into thinking and acting differently, and that's why there was any deserters at all. The movies originally depict them as purely soldiers and that's it. They're almost closer to droids than to the individual unique humans we see them depicted as in the show. It's much easier to believe that if they're cold-blooded killers, soldiers bred for fighting and taking orders, that they would have no problem listening to an order that came from their superior. But once you give all of these clones life and humanity and empathy, you kind of take that hard, ruthless killer quality away from them, and you almost need to introduce another reason of why they would turn on all their Jedi generals they had just bonded and become family with over the last 3 years. I think because of how the Clone Wars show portrayed clones, you have to take away their free will when it comes to Order 66. Because there's no way that these clones, there's no way they would ever execute their family if they had a say in the matter. So now we have these inhibitor chips that are like flipping a switch in the clone's brain. Later in Bad Batch, Wrecker gets activated, and after they remove his chip, he says he fought against it with everything he had. He tried to stop it, and he couldn't. It made him do things he didn't want to do. Even Rex says that he couldn't control it when it was trying to make him kill Ahsoka. So now we have this new chip making the clones go crazy. And I think if given the option, at least 90% of the clones would probably choose to have this removed if they knew about it. Some of the newer clones might be blinded by their desire to stay by the book and do what they're told and all that, but any clone that's been around for a while, I'm sure doesn't want to pick a fight with the Jedi or do anything as rash as that while not in control of themselves. My biggest question was always, why did Tup's chip malfunction? What happened that made him start going after all the Jedi? Filoni said that it was a genetic backfire, possibly a buildup of some repressed aggressive tendencies maybe, but that it was completely unpredictable, even to Palpatine and Dooku. But what's interesting is in Bad Batch, when Wrecker's chip is accidentally activated, it's because he bonked his head pretty hard. This caused him to get headaches that became more frequent and of greater intensity until one day he just snapped. What if the same thing happened to Tup? It's entirely possible before he malfunctioned that he sustained some sort of head injury that was just strong enough to activate his chip. Because 1 year after this, in the comic Kanan the Last Padawan, Order 66 happens and the clones kill Kanan's master and he escapes. Much later, the same clones that executed his master actually find and capture him, and they have another conversation around the confusion with Order 66. They end up both calling each other traitors, and then realize that Palpatine was the one that betrayed both of them. Kanan tries to reason with them, and when it doesn't work, he force pushes them into the wall, and it seems like here, Commander Grey gets hit hard enough into the wall that it may have broken his inhibitor chip. Kanan escapes, and in pursuit, Grey says that he realizes that Kanan was right about how they used to love their Jedi generals. Once the chips activated, they forgot all about their bond they had, and they recalled blindly following Order 66 almost if they were under some kind of spell, as if their will and freedom of choice went away. In the moment, it made him forget all the battles they fought together. Commander Grey ends up turning on the clones and blasts the controls of their ship, letting Kanan escape for good. So again, it does seem like a hard enough hit to the head will cause the chips to malfunction. This actually came out before Wrecker's bonk, but it's still interesting to know they're vulnerable. After they're activated and the deed is done, it feels like the clones are just supposed to go back to their normal selves, but now their view on the Jedi has been updated. They will forever just be traitors to the Republic while the chips are in their heads. But as the Empire took over, their Imperial control became less and less ethical, and apparently this caused more clones to desert and rebel, refusing to obey the Empire even while they still had their chips. Even Cody eventually realizes that the difference between clone troopers and mere droids is that the clones have the choice to follow orders. And he says a lot of the troopers were questioning Order 66, and he himself questions whether the Empire is actually making the galaxy a better place, and in the end, chooses to disappear, never to be seen again. And this is where the changes to Order 66 have finally come to a stop. It has changed so much over the years, from being a secret to existing along all the other contingency orders for anyone to see, to it being something the clones consciously did, to now it being something none of them had any control over. And as much as I think I enjoyed the brutal reality of the original Order 66, of the clones knowing what they had to do all along if it ever came down to it, and some of them struggling with the morality of it, I don't think you can have that and the Clone Wars show make sense without the inhibitor chip. I think because there was so much character development and maturity shown in the clones, I think they had to introduce the chip. You can't have the Clone Wars show and the clones having free will while executing the Jedi. It's just not possible. You have to pick one or the other. What would you prefer? There were so many amazing stories and tear-jerking moments throughout the show, and once you unlock those, there's just no going back. The clones from the movie didn't need an explanation of why the Jedi were bad. They just followed their orders and did what they were told. But these clones? These ones right here from the show? These clones would need answers and explanations if someone ordered them to shoot their Jedi generals. And that's why we have the chip. Without it, they would ask questions and refuse to follow such an order. And the chip took away their say in the matter. But I do want you to tell me what you think about this. Do you prefer the timeline without the inhibitor chip, or are you happy with the changes they made to the clones? Thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and send it to your Star Wars friends. It really helps support the channel. Until next time, I will see you in the comments, and remember, the Force will be with you always.